There are moments in life when the air around us seems to bend, as if reality itself hesitates before delivering a blow so heavy that the soul has no choice but to collapse inward. And the morning of my mother's funeral was exactly that kind of morning. The kind that tasted like iron and dust and unfinished truths. The kind where every breath echoed like footsteps inside a hollow room. The kind where the world felt suspended between what I believed I knew and what I was about to discover. And as I stepped out of the black car that brought me to the cemetery, a strange chill brushed across my arms, not from the wind, but from something deeper. Something close to an intuition that whispered that this day was not only about saying goodbye, but about opening a door I had never wanted to approach. Yet somehow it had been waiting for me for years, silent, patient, inevitable. The sky was heavy with muted clouds, the kind that looked swollen with unfallen rain, and beneath them, rows of gravestones stretched like a quiet army, unmoving, their cold stone surfaces carrying the names of people who had once breathed, laughed, cried, and fought like the rest of us, and now stood as mute witnesses to the secrets we leave behind. My mother had always been my shelter, the place where I found softness in a world that so often felt too sharp, and her absence hit me like a blade pressed slowly against the chest. Painful not only because of love, but because of the unanswered questions that haunted the last weeks of her life. She had left so suddenly, on a night that still replayed in my head like a broken film reel, and every time I tried to grasp what had really happened, the memory felt like smoke slipping through my fingers. I had been told she was rushed to the hospital after collapsing at home, that the ambulance had taken her straight to the emergency room, that the doctors had tried everything, yet standing near her coffin that morning, I could not shake the sense that something in that story simply did not add up. As if a puzzle piece had been forced into the wrong place, creating a picture that almost made sense but not quite. Family members murmured condolences around me, their voices blending with the somber hum of the morning breeze, but their words slipped past me without landing, because my mind was too focused on the cold clarity that settles in when grief mixes with suspicion, a clarity that made the small, unnoticed details from that night resurface like sharp fragments. I remembered the neighbor who said she heard a door slam just before the ambulance arrived, the unusual way my mother had sounded on the phone earlier that evening, her voice trembling with something that wasn't pain but fear, and the abruptness with which the hospital staff ended my call when I asked for more information. Yet even with these thoughts swirling inside me, I tried to hold on to the version of events everyone insisted was true, because believing the official story was easier than facing the possibility that something darker and more twisted had unfolded in the shadows of that night. Still, that strange intuition lingered like a weight in my chest, urging me to look closer, to listen deeper, to not let the softness of grief blind me to the shape of a hidden truth. As the ceremony prepared to begin, the hearse driver, an older man with tired eyes and a posture that suggested years of carrying sorrows that weren't his own, approached to check on the arrangements. His presence was routine, expected, nothing more than a part of the machinery of funerals. Yet when he glanced at me, his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if he recognized something in my face. Not my features, but the uncertainty behind them. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the mind playing tricks on a day already heavy with emotion. But then he stepped closer, lowering his voice not out of secrecy but out of respect for the weight of the moment, and something in his demeanor made the air around me tighten. He looked at my mother's coffin with a heaviness that seemed genuine, too genuine for someone who handled loss as part of his daily work, and when he finally spoke, his words felt like a small crack forming in the polished surface of the official narrative. He said that when he had arrived at the funeral home to receive my mother's body, something about the paperwork seemed off, as if the timeline didn't match the usual procedures. And though he tried to phrase it gently, there was a tension in his voice that suggested he had wrestled with whether to say anything at all. I froze, staring at him with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity, and he hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if uncertain whether he was allowed to voice what weighed on him. But then he leaned slightly closer and said that based on the transfer records and what the hospital staff had mentioned when he picked her up, my mother hadn't been headed to the hospital the night she died. The words hit me like a cold, invisible wave, swallowing the breath right out of my lungs, and for a moment, all the sounds around me blurred into a distant hum, as if I had been thrown underwater. I tried to grasp what he meant, tried to make sense of how such a statement could be true when everything I had been told pointed to the opposite, but my mind felt suspended, caught between disbelief and the creeping fear that the strange intuition that had haunted me for days was beginning to take shape. The driver seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had just said, because his expression shifted into one of regret, not for causing pain, but for confirming what my heart had already begun to suspect, and he added that he didn't know the full details, only that something in the story didn't align with the medical logs. He said it softly, almost apologetically, as if offering a piece of truth that he knew could shatter an already fragile world. And in that moment, the entire morning changed. The air felt heavier, the sky darker, the grief sharper, as if my mother's death had suddenly become a doorway into a mystery far deeper than I had ever imagined. I stood there in silence, gripping the edge of my coat as if holding onto the fabric could keep me grounded, and a swirl of emotions rushed through me. Confusion, anger, fear, and an overwhelming ache at the thought that my mother might have spent her final moments in circumstances I had never been told about. My memories of her in the days before her death now flickered with a new, unsettling meaning. Her restless glances toward the window, her reluctance to talk about where she had been the afternoon before, the way she kept misplacing things as if her mind were anywhere but present. I had dismissed those details as fatigue or stress, never imagining they could be pieces of a larger story she had intended to reveal, but never got the chance to. And now, standing at her funeral, the possibility that she had been heading somewhere else entirely, somewhere she either chose or was forced to go, burned through me like a cold flame, igniting a determination that pushed through the fog of grief. The ceremony continued around me, the priest's solemn words rising and falling like waves against the shore of my consciousness, but I heard almost none of it because my mind had latched onto the driver's revelation with the fierce grip of someone who refuses to let the truth slip away again. I felt the presence of my mother everywhere, in the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the scarf tied around my wrist, in the quiet stillness of the cold morning air that mirrored the serenity she always carried, in the heaviness in my chest that told me this moment, painful as it was the beginning of something I had been meant to uncover. And as I looked around the cemetery, surrounded by people who thought this day marked the end of her story, I felt with startling clarity that for me, it was only the beginning. A beginning filled with shadows and unanswered questions, but also with the stubborn pull of truth that refused to remain buried beneath polished explanations and incomplete reports. If you're listening to this story now, if you've reached this moment where grief and mystery meet like two rivers crashing into each other, I want you to take a breath with me, because this isn't just a funeral scene or a tragic memory. This is the threshold of a revelation that would change the course of everything that followed, and the weight of it is something I still feel even now, like a pulse beneath the surface of my chest. Before I go deeper into the layers of what I discovered after that moment, I want to invite you to share your own thoughts or feelings in the comments, because stories like this are not carried alone. They are shared, understood, and held collectively, and maybe your perspective will illuminate something I myself never saw. And as the first act of this journey reaches its quiet end, as the questions intensify and the shadows lengthen, I ask you to stay with me, to walk with me into the next chapter of this unfolding truth. If this story has already pulled you in, if you feel the weight of what is stirring beneath the surface, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is deeper, darker, and far more revealing than anything you've heard so far. The days that followed my mother's funeral unfolded like a blurred sequence of scenes where reality felt stretched thin, as though the world itself had been drained of color, leaving behind only a dull palette of gray tones that matched the heaviness pressing against my chest. I tried to resume the rhythm of normal life, to follow the motions of grief that society prescribes, the polite acknowledgments of sympathy, the silent meals, the empty bed, the careful avoidance of her favorite chair. But something inside me refused to move on. The driver's words replayed endlessly in my mind, looping through my thoughts until they became a haunting mantra that eroded every attempt at peace. She wasn't headed to the hospital that night. That sentence became an echo that reshaped every memory I held, each one now refracted through a prism of doubt. I found myself returning to that night again and again, trying to trace the outlines of what really happened, sifting through fragments of recollection as if rearranging broken glass into something coherent. My mother had been alone when she collapsed, or at least that was what I had been told, but now even that seemed uncertain. The police report had been brief, routine, almost perfunctory, as if written by someone who wanted to close the file quickly and move on. But the more I read it, the more I sensed what wasn't there: the gaps, the omissions, the silences between the lines. It was those silences that began to speak to me the loudest. I started visiting the hospital, hoping to find someone who remembered that night, someone who could clarify where she had been brought from, who had signed her admission papers, who had seen her last. The receptionist recognized my name and looked at me with the kind of pity reserved for those who have lost too much, but when I asked for records, her tone changed. She said certain files were restricted due to internal policy, that only the attending physician could authorize access. When I asked for his name, she hesitated for a fraction of a second, a hesitation that, to me, said everything. Her eyes darted toward a corridor behind her before returning to me, and in that instant, I sensed that she knew more than she was allowed to say. The air in that sterile lobby felt suddenly thick, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of rolling stretchers. And I realized I had stepped into a web where truth was a currency no one wanted to spend. I left the hospital that day feeling both defeated and electrified, a strange mixture of fear and determination pulsing through me. Because when the world begins to hide its answers, that's when you know the answers matter. I began to investigate quietly, collecting fragments of information wherever I could find them. I reached out to the ambulance service that supposedly transported her that night, pretending to confirm insurance details, and when they sent me a copy of the log, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The recorded destination wasn't the hospital, but an address I didn't recognize on the other side of town, a place that had been crossed out and overwritten later in handwriting that didn't match the rest of the form. It was small, almost invisible, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That was the moment I knew the driver hadn't been mistaken. My mother really hadn't been headed to the hospital. She had been going somewhere else, somewhere someone didn't want me to know about. The realization hit with the slow, steady pressure of a tide rising around me. Impossible to stop, impossible to ignore. I traced the address using public records, and what I found was a private clinic, officially closed 3 years earlier after an investigation for malpractice, though the file didn't specify details. It stood now as a ghost building, still registered, but abandoned, half forgotten. My mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Why would my mother have been taken there? Who decided that route? And what happened after she arrived, if she even did? That night, unable to sleep, I sat in the quiet of her old living room, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and the echoes of her presence, and began to search through her belongings with the reverence of an archaeologist, uncovering relics of a lost civilization. In her desk drawer, I found a small envelope sealed with tape, hidden beneath stacks of letters and unpaid bills. Inside was a photograph, faded but unmistakable. My mother standing beside a man I didn't recognize, both of them younger, smiling in front of a building that bore the same logo as the clinic I had just discovered. The back of the photo carried a date, 15 years earlier, and a short note written in her handwriting. For when the truth comes back. Those words made my heart pound because they implied knowledge, foresight, perhaps even fear. It meant she had known something, carried something, hidden something. I began to understand that whatever had happened to her wasn't random, and that the night she died might have been the culmination of something that had been silently unraveling for years. The following day, driven by a mix of dread and resolve, I went to that address. The clinic stood on the outskirts of the city, partially hidden by overgrown trees and surrounded by the kind of silence that feels deliberate. The gate was locked, the sign faded, the windows clouded with dust. Yet, as I approached, I noticed subtle signs that the place wasn't entirely abandoned. Tire marks on the gravel, a light fixture recently replaced, a faint hum from somewhere inside. My breath caught in my throat. I shouldn't have gone in, but curiosity often wears the mask of courage, and before I could think twice, I found a side entrance where the lock had been broken long ago. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp paper and metal, and the echo of my footsteps reverberated down empty corridors lined with peeling paint. I passed rooms filled with discarded equipment, old stretchers, files scattered like dried leaves. The silence was immense, but beneath it I could almost hear whispers, not literal ones, but the kind that live in walls, the residue of things once done and said. I found an office with filing cabinets still intact and began opening drawers, my hands trembling as if they already knew they were touching something forbidden. Most of the folders were empty, but one caught my attention, labeled with a date close to the night my mother died. Inside were forms and notes written in hurried handwriting, and one document had her name on it. It was a consent form, unsigned, with medical terms that I didn't fully understand, but whose tone made my stomach twist. Experimental treatment. Non-registered procedure. Confidential authorization. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold air, but from realization. Whatever my mother had been part of, it hadn't been sanctioned, and someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. I left the building shaken, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The sunlight outside felt unreal after the darkness inside, as if I had emerged not from a building but from a dream. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that grief was distorting my perception, but deep down I knew that what I had found was real. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, even if I couldn't yet see the full picture. I needed answers, but I also needed allies, someone who could help me interpret what I was uncovering. I reached out to an old friend of my mother's, a retired nurse named Clara, who had worked at several clinics in the city, including, as it turned out, that same facility before it was shut down. When I told her what I had found, there was a long silence on the line, and then she said something that sent a shiver through me. She was trying to stop them. Clara wouldn't say more over the phone, only that we should meet in person. But when I went to her apartment the next day, the building manager told me she had been taken to the hospital the previous night after what they called an incident. No one could tell me more. It was as if a shadow had begun to move ahead of me, clearing traces, silencing voices. I felt like I had stepped into a story that was rewriting itself as I pursued it. A story where truth was both the prize and the danger. That night, unable to rest, I returned to the only constant I had left, the photo. I stared at the man beside my mother, his face unfamiliar yet oddly recognizable, and searched for him online using every tool I could find. Hours passed, until finally, buried in an old news archive, I found him. His name appeared in connection with a research project at that same clinic, shut down years earlier due to ethical violations involving human trials. The report mentioned 2 researchers who had turned whistleblowers, but only one was named: my mother. The world tilted beneath me as I realized what that meant. She hadn't been a patient there. She had been part of something. And then she had turned against it. The note on the back of the photo, the secrecy, the strange fear in her eyes before she died. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. She had carried a truth someone didn't want revealed. And on the night she died, That truth had finally caught up to her. The next days became a blur of discovery and dread. I followed every lead, every name, every document, until I began to piece together a hidden history that connected the clinic, the research, and my mother's disappearance. She had been preparing to release information, files she had copied, names she had recorded, but before she could, someone intercepted her. I didn't know how far this reached or who was involved, but one thing became clear. Her death hadn't been an accident. It had been the silence that follows truth too loud to be ignored. Yet even as that realization broke me, it also gave me purpose. For the first time since she died, I felt her presence not as absence but as guidance. It was as though she had left breadcrumbs for me to find, small pieces of herself scattered across the years, waiting for me to pick them up and finish what she had started. By the end of that week, I stood again at her grave, the city's noise muted behind the iron gates, and made a quiet vow. I would uncover everything. I would tell the story she couldn't. I would make sure her truth was no longer buried under lies and polished eulogies. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else. Something like resolve. And as I left the cemetery, I knew that what awaited me next would not only test my courage, but reshape the very understanding of who my mother truly was and what she had died protecting. Before I move forward into the heart of that revelation, before the final act where everything I discovered comes crashing together, take a moment with me. What would you have done in my place? Would you keep digging, or would you let the past rest, even if the past refuses to rest itself? Tell me in the comments, because your thoughts matter more than you think. Stories like this breathe through shared reflection. Before we step deeper into what happened next, I want to pause for a heartbeat and invite you. If this story has already pulled you under its tide, if you've felt the pulse of mystery and grief interwoven with the fragile threads of truth, to subscribe now, because what comes next is the turning point. The revelation that tore through everything I thought I knew and left me staring into the raw, trembling light of what my mother had truly lived and died for. It was no longer a question of whether she had been taken somewhere else or whether the clinic had played a role. The question now was why, and what secret was so dangerous it had followed her even into death. In the days following my vow at her grave, I became someone else. No longer simply a grieving child, but a seeker crossing into the unknown, guided by fragments of her memory and the unwavering pulse of intuition. My mother had been a woman of compassion, a nurse, a scientist, someone whose quiet strength carried both intellect and empathy. To imagine her entangled in something dark was unbearable, but to deny it now would be to betray her courage. The old photograph remained on my desk, its edges worn from the number of times I picked it up and stared at it, hoping it would speak. The man beside her, the unnamed partner in that forbidden research, had once looked at her with trust. I could see it even in the way their shoulders leaned toward each other. But when I searched deeper, his story ended abruptly a decade ago. A sudden disappearance after the clinic scandal, no obituary, no trace. It was as if he had evaporated into the fog of erased history. The further I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't merely about medicine or ethics. It was about human lives, about something that had blurred the boundaries between saving and controlling, between healing and harm. I began visiting archives, libraries, forgotten government offices where old files gathered dust. Every folder I opened felt like pulling on a thread attached to something vast and trembling beneath the surface of ordinary life. One evening, deep within a municipal storage basement that smelled of mildew and paper, I found a report from the investigation into the clinic's closure. The official summary spoke of procedural irregularities and data mismanagement, sterile words meant to cover deeper sins, but attached to the back, almost by accident, was a handwritten page, a note by an investigator who had later resigned. It said, 2 subjects unaccounted for, 1 whistleblower missing, evidence transferred off record. My mother's initials were beside those words. My vision blurred as I read it, and I had to sit on the cold floor for a while, because the enormity of what it implied made my chest feel hollow. She hadn't just been part of the clinic. She had been the one who tried to expose it. And the consequence had followed her all the way to that final night. The realization became a storm that refused to quiet. I began connecting names, tracing financial records, following the faint trail of donations that had funded the clinic's research. One company name appeared repeatedly, a pharmaceutical conglomerate that had rebranded itself over the years, shedding scandals like old skin. My mother's old computer, which I had kept untouched since her passing, now became my window into her hidden world. It took hours of guessing passwords, of piecing together personal clues, until finally it opened. And there, in a hidden folder buried under unrelated documents, I found her digital journal. The entries began years earlier, written in a tone both weary and determined, chronicling her growing disillusionment with the project she once believed would change lives. She wrote about treatments that were supposed to cure neurological diseases, but whose results were being manipulated. She wrote about patients being kept beyond ethical limits, about trials conducted without consent. And then, near the end, her entries changed, shorter, frantic, as if she knew she was being watched. The last entry was a single line that made my blood run cold. "If they find this, tell the truth. They know I didn't go willingly." The words struck like lightning. They confirmed what I had feared. Her final journey that night hadn't been her choice. Whatever happened, she had been taken against her will. And somehow, the driver who had spoken at her funeral, the man who had unknowingly set all this in motion, had carried a fragment of her final story without realizing its weight. I needed to find him again, to ask him what else he knew. After some searching, I located his home, a modest apartment above a small repair shop. When he opened the door and saw me, recognition flickered across his face, followed by hesitation. He looked older than I remembered, his eyes shadowed by years of seeing grief pass through his hands. When I told him I had found evidence that my mother hadn't died the way we'd been told, he didn't seem surprised, only burdened, as if he had expected me to come eventually. He admitted that the night of the transfer, he had been ordered to change the destination mid-route. A man in a dark suit had entered the ambulance before departure, handed him a sealed envelope with instructions, and told him not to question anything. When the driver asked about the patient, the man replied that she was being relocated for confidentiality. He said my mother had been conscious when they loaded her in, calm but resigned, as though she knew resistance would be useless. That image, my mother, silent in that ambulance, staring out into the night, perhaps knowing where she was being taken, carved itself into me like an open wound. The driver told me he had kept the envelope all these years, locked away out of fear, but now he wanted me to have it. Inside, I found a single paper with a symbol, the same emblem I had seen on the clinic's old letterhead, and beneath it, a coded string of numbers and letters. It took days of deciphering, tracing through digital archives and old encryption methods, until I realized it was a reference code for an internal database once hosted by the corporation that funded the research. With help from a cybersecurity expert I contacted anonymously, I managed to access fragments of that database. What I discovered was staggering. Detailed reports of medical trials carried out under false names, hidden subsidiaries funneling data through shell organizations, and within those files, my mother's name listed not as a patient or employee, but as Subject 0, Control Witness. It meant she had become part of the experiment, not biologically, but ethically, as the control observer meant to verify results. And when she refused to falsify data, they turned against her. The truth emerged like a slow dawn breaking over a battlefield, painful, blinding, inevitable. The clinic had been testing a neural treatment meant to suppress trauma by altering memory pathways, a process that could have redefined psychiatry or destroyed it entirely if abused. My mother had seen what it did to patients, the way it erased pain, but also identity, leaving behind hollow shells of who they had been. She had tried to stop it, had gathered evidence, but someone powerful decided silence was cheaper than reform. The night she was taken, they intended to bring her to that abandoned clinic one last time, to ensure the data she carried never surfaced. But something went wrong. Maybe she resisted. Maybe her heart failed under stress. Maybe fate intervened. The driver had unknowingly delivered her to the edge of that secret, and she had died before they could erase her completely. Knowing this didn't bring peace. It brought a heavy clarity, a kind of ache that settles deep in the bones. I sat for hours staring at her last journal entry, the words glowing softly on the computer screen, and realized that she had trusted me to finish what she couldn't. I contacted journalists, investigators, anyone who might listen. At first, doors closed in my face. No one wanted to confront a corporation that had already buried its sins beneath money and time. But I persisted, driven not by vengeance but by love, by the quiet, unyielding love of a child determined to honor the truth of the person who raised them. And slowly, like dawn spreading across a stubborn night, people began to listen. One journalist took the risk of publishing an initial exposé, citing anonymous sources and leaked documents. It caused ripples, then waves. The story reached former employees who had kept silent for years, and one by one they began to come forward. Testimonies surfaced, investigations reopened, and soon the same name that once funded secrecy was forced into the light of accountability. Through all of this, I felt my mother's presence everywhere. In the hum of the computer, in the flicker of the lamp as I worked late into the night, in the quiet moments before sleep when her voice seemed to whisper not in words, but in the rhythm of my heartbeat. I realized that grief is not something you leave behind. It transforms, becomes the compass guiding you toward meaning. And even though uncovering her truth meant confronting horror, it also meant reclaiming her dignity. She hadn't died as a victim, she had died as a protector of truth. When the corporation finally issued a statement admitting irregularities, it felt hollow, rehearsed, but it was enough to open legal action. A memorial fund was established in her name for ethical medical research, and I stood at the ceremony holding the same photograph I had once found hidden in her drawer. I looked at her smile, the defiant light in her eyes, and knew she had won. Not in life, but in legacy. The truth had survived. And yet, even after all of it, part of me still wonders what she saw in those final moments. Whether she knew that one day her child would trace every hidden path she left behind and carry her story into the open air. Maybe she did. Maybe that's why she left the note on the photo, the journal, the breadcrumbs, not out of fear, but faith. Faith that love would finish what courage began. Now that the storm has settled, I carry her memory not as a wound, but as light. A fragile, flickering truth that refuses to die. Because some stories are not meant to be silenced. They are meant to echo. To remind us that even in the darkest places, love can be the fiercest kind of rebellion. There is a silence that arrives only after storms, not the empty kind that follows destruction, but a deep, breathing stillness that feels like the earth itself taking a sigh of relief. That was the silence that filled my world in the months after the truth came to light. When the headlines had faded, the trials had ended, and the noise of revelation finally quieted into memory. I remember standing by the ocean one morning, the wind cool against my face, the horizon stretching endlessly, and for the first time in years, I felt the world open again. Not as a place of loss, but of continuance. My mother's story had traveled far, beyond the confines of grief, beyond secrecy, into a kind of immortality that belongs only to those whose courage outlives them. People who had never met her wrote to me, thanking her for what she had done, for the truth she had fought to protect. Some shared their own stories of silence and bravery, of injustice and love. And in reading their words, I understood that my mother had not simply uncovered corruption, she had sparked something larger, a quiet revolution of conscience that moved from one heart to another, like fire passed gently from candle to candle, not to burn, but to illuminate. In the stillness of those days, I began to rebuild. I sold the old house and moved into a small apartment near the coast, where the sound of waves became the rhythm of my days. I filled the space with photographs of her, not as reminders of pain, but as anchors of gratitude. Each image told a story, her laughter beneath sunlight, her eyes squinting as she painted, her hands guiding mine through the motions of some long-forgotten recipe. I realized then that memory isn't about holding on to sorrow. It's about carrying the essence of love forward, allowing it to shape the life that remains. I found work in advocacy, helping families navigate the aftermath of medical injustice. And though the cases I faced were often heavy, I carried them with the strength she had taught me. Quiet, steadfast, compassionate. There were nights when I still woke from dreams where she stood by that clinic gate, looking at me with that familiar calm as if to say, "You did it. You brought it home." And I would smile in the dark, because even though the ache of her absence never truly disappeared, it had softened into something like light. Over time, the world began to forget the finer details of the scandal, as it always does, but I never allowed her story to be buried again. I turned it into something living, a foundation in her name, dedicated to transparency in science and ethical practice. We hosted conferences, funded independent research, offered scholarships for students driven by both intellect and empathy. Her name became a symbol not of tragedy, but of integrity. And sometimes, during those events, I would see young researchers looking at her portrait with admiration, unaware of the full weight of what she endured. And I felt peace in knowing that the truth she gave her life for was still breathing through them. The corporation that once silenced her was dissolved, its executives scattered into obscurity, and though justice never truly feels enough to match what is lost, it was enough to let the world turn again with a little more honesty in its orbit. But more than any of that, more than justice, more than closure, what I cherish most now is the quiet way her love continues to echo through my life. It's in the way I pause before making a decision, hearing her voice in the back of my mind, reminding me to choose kindness even when the world doesn't. It's in the smell of lavender that still lingers when I least expect it, or the sudden stillness of a morning when sunlight hits the window just the way it used to when she read by the kitchen table. Grief, I've learned, is not the opposite of life. It's proof that love endures beyond endings. And though there are moments when the weight of everything she went through still makes my chest tighten, I also know she wouldn't want me to live within that shadow forever. She would want me to walk forward, to live fully, to laugh loudly, to let joy exist alongside memory. Sometimes I return to the cemetery where she rests, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. The marble is cool beneath my fingertips, the engraved letters softened by time, and I talk to her as if she can hear every word. I tell her about the people she helped without ever meeting them, about the ripple her courage created, about how I've finally forgiven myself for not knowing sooner what she carried alone. I leave a small seashell each time, a symbol of the ocean she loved and the endlessness she believed in. And as I stand there, I no longer feel that hollow, aching question that once haunted me, the desperate why. Because now I understand that the why doesn't matter as much as the how we carry on, how we remember, how we turn pain into purpose. That's what she taught me, even in her silence. As I walk away from her grave, the wind often rises, brushing against my shoulders like a gentle touch, and I imagine it's her way of saying she's proud. The sky opens above, vast and forgiving, and I think of how everything in life, no matter how fractured, eventually circles back to peace. My mother didn't die in vain. Her truth became my compass. Her love became my map. And the path she carved through the darkness led me here, to a life lived not in the shadow of loss, but in the light of remembrance. Now, if you've journeyed with me through every twist of this story, through grief and discovery, fear and revelation, through the storm and into this calm, I want to thank you, because stories like this only live when they are heard, when they touch something inside the listener that says, I understand. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you've loved and lost, or of a truth you've carried silently, I invite you to honor it, not just by remembering my mother's name, but by holding space for your own stories of courage. And if you'd like to help these stories continue, to let them reach others who need them, I gently ask you to like this video, to subscribe, and to stay with me for the next story, because every end is also a beginning, and every beginning deserves to be told with heart. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Tell the truth, love deeply, and leave behind something that refuses to be forgotten. And as I close this chapter, I know that somewhere beyond all of this, my mother is smiling, not because the world finally heard her, but because I finally did.